Elias was 13 when they cast him out. He remembered the ash on his face and the raw scrape in his throat from shouting. He had tried to tell them. He had seen the signs his father had taught him to see. The way the squirrels frantically buried green pine cones, the unnatural stillness in the deep woods, the copper haze that clung to the horizon long after sunset, a haze that tasted of metal and dry dust. "A crown fire is coming," he had told the town council, his voice a boy's high-pitched plea. "A real one. It will not creep, it will jump." Mayor Thompson had looked down from his polished oak chair. He had looked at the wild-eyed orphan boy, smeared with dirt and earnest terror. He had laughed. Not a kind laugh. It was a dry, dismissive sound. The sound of a man who believed in ledgers and property lines, not in the frantic burying habits of squirrels. "Son," the mayor had said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you've spent too much time in the woods with that half-wild father of yours. You see monsters behind every tree. It's just a dry spell." The fire came 3 days later. It was not the crown fire Elias had foreseen, the one his father called a sky-eater. It was a smaller, faster ground fire that chewed through the dry underbrush and licked at the western edge of town. It took 2 barns and Mr. Abernathy's lumber mill before the men, organized and grim-faced, managed to beat it back with wet sacks and desperate trenches. They called it a victory. They called Elias a liar, a fearmonger, a boy who cried wolf, or in this case, fire. They said his panicked warning had caused more trouble than the fire itself. They said he had a darkness in him, inherited from a father who preferred the company of trees to that of men. They did not beat him. They did not jail him. They did something colder. They exiled him with their silence. No one would sell him flour. No one would meet his eye. Children who were once his friends now threw stones that landed just short of his feet, a message of contempt, not of harm. So he left. At 13, he took his father's worn pack, a tinderbox, a small axe, and the leather-bound journals filled with his father's spidery script. He walked out of the town of prosperity and did not look back. He walked until the memory of their scorn was a dull ache instead of a sharp sting. 10 years passed. 10 years of solitude. 10 years of reading the journals by firelight until he knew the words by heart. 10 years of learning the forest not just as a home, but as a language. He learned that the fire they had fought was a warning shot, a clearing of the throat before the sermon. His father's journals were clear on this point. After a small fire in a long drought, the forest floor was cleared. The next fire would have less to feed on near the ground. It would have no choice but to climb. It would have no choice but to crown. Elias was 23 now. He was no longer a boy. He was lean and hard, his face weathered like old rock. He lived in a small cabin he had built himself, 5 miles from Prosperity, on the slope of a great granite hill. He had a mule, a quiet, sturdy creature he called Boulder. They were a silent partnership. One spring morning, Elias saw the sign. It was subtle. A particular species of woodpecker, one that always nested in high pines, was building its nests in low, scrubby oaks. He checked his father's journal. Page 47. The high birds seek low ground when the sky promises to burn. He knew it was time. His plan was not born of fear, but of certainty. It was a blueprint laid down in his father's last journal, a chapter titled, "On Stone and Earth, the Answer to Fire." He would build a dugout, a sanctuary, Not a root cellar, but a true dwelling, carved into the granite heart of the hill. A place where the fire could rage over, a wave of destruction passing harmlessly above, leaving life untouched below. A flicker of old duty, a ghost of the boy who tried to warn them, stirred in his chest. He owed them nothing. Their scorn had been his crucible, forging him into the self-reliant man he was. But the memory of the women and children, their faces pale in the firelight of that lesser blaze, prodded him. He cleaned himself as best he could, put on a shirt that was not patched in more than 2 places, and walked the 5 miles back to Prosperity. The town had grown. It was prouder. Mr. Abernathy, his fortune rebuilt tenfold, was constructing a massive new home on the edge of town. A monument of timber and glass, it was called Abernathy Spire. Elias found Mayor Thompson in his office. The man was older, heavier. His hair was silver, but his eyes held the same dismissive certainty. Elias did not plead this time. His voice was calm and low. He laid out the signs. The woodpeckers. The deep, resonant dryness of the soil. The way the pine sap was weeping from the trees, a sign of extreme stress. Another fire is coming, Elias stated. A great one. This year or the next. It will take the crowns of the trees. It will move faster than a running horse. He did not speak of his dugout. Instead, he proposed a community shelter, a fire-safe bunker dug into the hillside behind the church. He explained the principles: the earth as insulation, the stone as a shield. Mayor Thompson listened, his fingers steepled. When Elias finished, the mayor leaned back in his leather chair. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he said, the words thick with amusement. "The fire crier returns. 10 years in the wild, and you're still singing the same mad song." He stood and walked to the window, gesturing to the bustling street. "Look, boy, this is the town of Prosperity. We have a new fire pump, imported all the way from the city. We have a volunteer brigade, drilled weekly. We have progress. We don't have time for squirrel watching and old wives' tales." "This isn't a tale," Elias said, his voice flat. "It's a pattern. My father documented it for 30 years. "Your father," the mayor snorted, turning from the window, "was a man who died chasing a beaver into a frozen river. Forgive me if I don't stake the town's future on his scribblings." The dismissal was absolute. Elias turned and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. The story was all over town by noon. Elias, the mad hermit, the fire crier, had come back to rave about the sky burning. It became the joke of the week. Dr. Finch, a man of science and starched collars, held court in the general store. "The boy is suffering from a wilderness-induced hysteria," he proclaimed, adjusting his spectacles. "He anthropomorphizes nature. It's a classic symptom of prolonged isolation. The forest isn't thinking or planning, for heaven's sake. It's simply a dry summer." Mr. Abernathy, overseeing the placement of a grand cedar staircase in his new mansion, laughed the loudest. "A house of dirt and rock," he bellowed to his workmen, "while we are building with the finest timber in the state. Let the boy dig his own grave. I prefer to live in the sky." His words gave the project its name: Elias's Grave. The name stuck. It was a cruel and easy thing to say. When a plan was foolish, when an effort was doomed to fail, people in Prosperity would shake their heads and say, "He's digging an Elias." The children, ever cruel in their mimicry, would see him in the distance on his hill and chant, "Elias, Elias, digging his grave. The fire is coming to make him its slave." Elias heard it all. the whispers carried on the wind. He heard them when he bought his supplies, sacks of salt, barrels of flour, tools. The storekeeper would take his money with a pitying look, sometimes adding an old apple to his sack, a gesture one might give to a doomed man. He did not react. Their words were wind, their scorn was smoke. He had work to do. The work began on the first day of summer. He and Boulder were a team. Elias would drill into the granite face of the hill with a star drill and a sledgehammer. It was brutal, mind-numbing labor. The ringing of steel on stone was the only sound for hours. Strike, turn, strike, turn. The rhythm was a prayer of persistence. Once the holes were deep enough, he would pack them, using the slow, careful chemistry his father had outlined. Then he would retreat to a safe distance and detonate the charge. The blast would echo across the valley, a deep-throated cough from the hill. Then came Boulder's work. Elias would lever the shattered rock onto a stone boat, a heavy wooden sledge. Boulder, patient and immensely strong, would drag the tons of rock away from the growing cavern. Day after day, week after week, the pile of excavated rock grew into a small mountain. The hole in the hillside deepened. He worked through the heat of summer, his body a slick machine of muscle and sweat. He worked through the autumn, the cool air a balm. He worked until the first snows forced him to stop. He had a cavity, a rough-hewn room, 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide. It was a start. The first winter, he lived in his old cabin, spending the nights carving the pine beams he would need. He was a meticulous craftsman. He cut mortise and tenon joints that fit together with the precision of a watchmaker. These were not rough supports. They were the bones of a house, meant to last forever. When spring thawed the ground, the work resumed. The cavern went deeper. He began to shape it, carving out niches for shelves, a bed platform, a firebox. The firebox was a work of genius, a direct copy of his father's diagrams. It was built of soapstone, which held heat for hours. The flue was not a straight pipe. It was a complex, winding channel of stone that snaked up through 30 feet of rock and earth. The opening was small, covered by a heavy stone cap and protected by a series of baffles designed to stop any errant ember that might find its way down. It was a dragon's throat, designed to breathe out, but not in. He designed a second, smaller flue for ventilation, placed on the opposite side of the dwelling. This ensured a constant, slow circulation of fresh air. He lined the entire interior with flat stones, mortared together so tightly a knife blade could not find a crack. It was slow, painstaking work. Each stone was chosen, shaped, and fitted. It was a puzzle of 1,000 pieces. The townspeople would sometimes ride out on a Sunday just to look. They would stand at a distance, watching the solitary man and his mule toiling against the unyielding hill. They would watch him, wrestling with stones a quarter-ton in weight, using nothing but levers, rollers, and his own strength. They would shake their heads. It was a madness, a grand, pointless madness. Still digging his grave, they would mutter to each other, before riding back to their sensible wooden houses. The second summer passed into a second winter. He had the main chamber complete. Now came the entrance. He built a thick stone archway, using a keystone that weighed as much as Boulder. He hung a door, not of wood, but of solid iron, salvaged from an old mine and hauled for miles on a cart. It was set deep into the rock, fitting into a stone frame. The final piece of the main construction was the roof. He laid his massive pine beams across the top of the excavated chamber. On top of this, he layered thick planks of wood. then a layer of tarred hide for waterproofing. And then, the earth. For months, he and Boulder moved the earth back. They buried the structure. Ton after ton of soil and rock was piled on top until the dwelling had vanished. It was part of the hill again. He left only the stone face of the entrance exposed, and the two small, capped flue openings hidden amongst the rocks far up the slope. He planted the deep-rooted grasses his father recommended. He transplanted moss and wild shrubs. Within a year, the surgical scar on the hillside had healed. Elias's grave had disappeared. It looked like nothing more than a small cave entrance, the kind a bear might use for a den. 2 years. 2 years of his life poured into the earth. He spent the 3rd year provisioning it. He built shelves and filled them with jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meats, dried fruits. He built a cistern deep in the rock that would collect filtered seepage, providing a constant source of cool, clean water. He stockpiled firewood, grain for Boulder, oil for his lamp, books, tools, everything needed to survive not just a fire, but a winter. Or 2. He moved from his cabin into the dugout. Life changed. The world outside, with its shifting temperatures and sudden winds, became a distant thing. Inside the earth, the temperature was a constant, cool in the summer, mild in the winter. It was utterly silent. The only sounds were his own breathing and the soft munching of Boulder in his stone-lined stool. It was a sanctuary of peace. It was a fortress of solitude. It was ready. The summer of the 4th year was the one. It arrived with a malevolent stillness. The heat was not the familiar baking heat of a normal summer. It was a brittle, predatory heat. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, hazy at the edges. No clouds formed. Not for a week. Then, not for a month. The creek on Elias's land dried up. The grasses turned from green to gold to a sere, crackling brown. Then came the signs his father had written of in the final, urgent pages of his last journal. The pine needles on the oldest trees began to turn a sickly, rust-red color, their resin boiling out in sticky, amber tears. This was the sign of a tree dying of thirst from the inside out. The birds vanished. The cheerful chatter of jays and sparrows fell silent. The forest was unnervingly quiet. There was no birdsong at dawn. Then came the exodus, a river of small animals, mice, voles, rabbits, even foxes and weasels began to move. They streamed out of the high country, heading for the river valley, their movements frantic and desperate. They were not running from a predator they could see. They were fleeing a danger they could feel in their bones. Elias stood on his hill and watched it all. He felt the air. It was light and thin, with a static charge that made the hairs on his arms stand up. It smelled of hot rock and dust, with a faint, underlying scent of something metallic and scorched, like a blacksmith's forge left to cool. It was the smell of the fire that was not yet here. On the morning of August 14th, he knew the time had come. A wind had picked up overnight. It was a hot, dry wind from the west, the kind his father called a devil's breath. It did not cool. It cooked. He did not rush. His preparations were already complete. He performed his final tasks with a calm, methodical grace. He brought the last of his tools inside. He filled the water trough for Boulder. He checked the seal on the iron door one last time, oiling the hinges. He stood at the entrance of his dugout and looked toward prosperity. He could see the town shimmering in the heat haze. He could see the proud, foolish spire of Mr. Abernathy's new house, a monument to wood, in a world that was about to burn. He thought for a moment of walking those 5 miles one last time. He thought of standing in the center of town and screaming his warning until his throat was raw. The memory of their laughter stopped him. The memory of the mayor's sneer, the chanted insults of the children, the cold, pitying eyes of the storekeeper. They had been given their warning 10 years ago. They had been given another 2 years ago. They had chosen not to listen. To warn them now would be to invite only more scorn, to be called the madman one final time before the end. His duty was not to them. His duty was to the truth his father had passed down to him. His duty was to survive. He turned his back on the town. He led Boulder into the cool, dark interior. He swung the heavy iron door shut. The sound of it locking was a deep, final thud, a boom of stone and steel that shut the world out. The fire began 20 miles to the west, some said from a lightning strike in a dead tree. On any other day, in any other year, it would have been a small thing, a ground fire that burned itself out in a few acres of underbrush. But not on this day. The devil's breath caught the first spark and fanned it into a ravenous sheet of flame. The fire did not creep, it ran. It devoured the tinder-dry forest floor, and, finding nothing more to eat below, it climbed. It climbed the parched, resin-weeping trunks of the great pines. It reached the crowns. And then the world changed. It became a crown fire. It was no longer a thing of the ground. It was a thing of the sky. It leaped from treetop to treetop, a roaring, incandescent wave that moved with the speed of the wind. It did not burn the forest. It vaporized it. The sound was not the crackle of a campfire. It was a constant, deafening roar, the sound of 1,000 freight trains at once. It hit the town of Prosperity at precisely 3:12 in the afternoon. It did not arrive as a creeping line of fire. It arrived as a physical blow. A wall of superheated air came first, shattering windows and peeling paint from walls. Then came the storm of embers, a blizzard of burning coals that ignited everything it touched. The volunteer fire brigade, so drilled and proud, was useless. Their new pump was connected to a creek that had become a muddy trickle. The hoses burned in their hands. The town's wooden buildings, the source of their prosperity, became their funeral pyres. Houses ignited not one by one, but all at once, as if by a vengeful god's command. Mr. Abernathy's spire, his monument of timber and glass, lasted less than 5 minutes. It burned with a ferocious, almost personal intensity. The grand cedar staircase became a ladder of flame. The vast glass windows exploded outward, and the whole structure imploded into a mountain of fire. Panic was absolute. People ran into the streets only to find the air itself was fire. The systems they believed in, their government, their technology, their community, crumbled to ash in minutes. Inside the hill, Elias felt a deep, resonant vibration. The roar of the firestorm was not a sharp sound. It was a low, powerful hum that he felt in his bones, in the stone floor beneath him. The air in the dugout remained cool and still. The stone walls did not even grow warm to the touch. He lit a single oil lamp, its gentle glow pushing back the perfect darkness. He sat on his cot and read from one of his father's books. Boulder stood calmly in his stool, munching on his grain, untroubled. Above them, the world was ending. The fire, a thing of mythic violence, raged over the hill, consuming the very air. It passed over the thick blanket of earth and stone that was his roof, It passed, and it did not notice them. They were a stone in the heart of the inferno, untouched, unmoved, safe. The firestorm passed in an hour, but the world burned for a day. When the deep roaring overhead finally subsided into a dull hiss, Elias waited. He waited a full day more, letting the world outside cool. On the morning of the second day, he opened the heavy iron door. The world was gone. Everything was black and grey. The sky was a thick, suffocating blanket of brown smoke. The ground was a uniform carpet of hot ash. The skeletons of burned trees clawed at the sky like blackened bones. The air was thick and tasted of soot. There was no sound, no birds, no insects, nothing. The town of Prosperity was a collection of smouldering ruins. A few stone chimneys stood like tombstones, marking the places where homes had been. He saw the first survivor an hour later, a figure stumbling through the grey landscape, a ghost in the ash. As it drew closer, Elias saw it was a man, his clothes in tatters, his face and hands blackened. He was coughing, a deep, racking cough that shook his entire body. It was Dr. Finch. The man of science looked up and saw Elias, clean and whole, standing in the stone doorway. He saw the wisp of clean smoke rising from the hidden chimney. His eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, met Elias's. Dr. Finch did not speak. He simply collapsed in the ash, a dozen feet from the door. Elias walked out to him. He lifted the doctor, who was surprisingly light, and carried him inside. He laid him on a blanket, cleaned his face with a damp cloth, and gave him a cup of cool, clean water from the cistern. The doctor drank it greedily, then looked around at the smooth stone walls, the well-stocked shelves, the calm mule watching him from its stall. He looked at the impossible, solid reality of it all.
"Elias's grave,"
he whispered, his voice a raw croak. He began to weep, deep, silent, shuddering sobs of a man whose entire world of logic had been burned to the ground. Elias said nothing. He simply tended to the man's burns with a salve of comfrey and honey, a remedy from his father's journal. Soon there were more. They came in ones and twos, then in small family groups. They were the ones who had survived by fleeing to the river, spending the night submerged in the shallow water with wet cloths over their faces. They were burned, traumatized, and utterly broken. They saw the impossible sanctuary in the hill and stumbled toward it, their last hope. Elias took them all in. He did not ask questions. He did not utter a single word of reproach. His face showed no triumph, no, "I told you so." He was simply a calm center in the ruin. He became their leader without trying. He organized the small space, making room for the children and the wounded. He rationed his food and water, ensuring everyone had something. He moved with a quiet efficiency that commanded more respect than any shouted order. The people of Prosperity, who had mocked him and called him a fool, now watched his every move with a desperate, reverent awe. The last group arrived near dusk. It was a small, haggard procession, led by Mayor Thompson. His fine suit was burned and torn. His face was a mask of grime and despair. Behind him, supported by two other men, was Mr. Abernathy. The lumber baron, the man who was going to live in the sky, was weeping like a child. His hands burned raw. His spire was gone. Everything was gone. Mayor Thompson stood before Elias in the doorway of the dugout. The two men looked at each other. The mayor's eyes, once so full of arrogant certainty, were now hollowed out by what he had seen. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry sob came out. He hung his head in a gesture of complete and utter surrender. Elias simply stepped aside, holding the door open for them to enter. Weeks passed. The smoke cleared. Relief parties arrived from other towns, bringing supplies and news. The scale of the devastation was absolute. Prosperity was not just damaged, it was erased. A meeting was held. It was not in a town hall, for none remained. It was held in the open, amidst the ashes, with the survivors sitting on charred logs and broken stones. Elias stood to one side, separate as always. Mayor Thompson, his voice hoarse but clear, stood before them all. He did not speak of rebuilding. He did not speak of relief funds. He spoke of pride. "We were a proud town," he said, his voice cracking. "We were proud of our progress, of our fine wooden homes, of our modern thinking. And our pride turned this town to ash." He turned and faced Elias directly. Dr. Finch and Mr. Abernathy came and stood beside him.
"There was a man who tried to warn us," the mayor said, his voice ringing with a terrible clarity. "A boy at first, then a man. He did not rely on pride. He relied on wisdom. He listened to the world, while we listened only to the sound of our own hammers and saws." He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing before Elias. He looked him in the eye. "You were right," Mayor Thompson said, the words costing him everything and yet freeing him completely. "We were wrong. We were fools, blinded by our own light. We mocked you. We called your sanctuary a grave. And we were the ones who buried ourselves." Mr. Abernathy, his hands bandaged, let out a choked sob. "He was right," he echoed. "Completely and fatally wrong," Dr. Finch added, his voice low and firm. "I, who prized knowledge, was the most ignorant of all." The public apology hung in the still air. It was a complete and total vindication, a cleansing of the old scorn. Elias looked at the three humbled men. He looked at the faces of the survivors watching him. He saw no hatred in them, only a desperate, pleading hope. He inclined his head, a small, simple nod of acknowledgement. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it always was. Calm, low, unhurried. "The fire was not your enemy," he said. "It does what it has always done. The forest understands this. It will grow back. The mistake was in the building. You built with pride. You must rebuild with humility. You must build with stone and earth. You must listen to the signs." He did not offer forgiveness. He did not need to. He offered something more valuable. "I will teach you," he said. And he did. The town of Prosperity was reborn from its own ashes. But it was a different town. The houses were not tall structures of wood. They were low, solid dwellings built into the hillsides, their faces made of stone and their roofs of thick, living earth. They were modelled, every one of them, on Elias's dugout. The phrase, "digging an Elias," was reborn too. It no longer meant a fool's errand. It came to mean an act of profound wisdom and foresight. To build a strong foundation, to prepare for hardship, to listen to the quiet truths of the world. That was digging an Elias. Elias never moved into the new town. He remained in his home on the hill, a silent guardian watching over them. He never married. He never sought a position of power.
His solitude was too deeply ingrained. But he was never an outcast again. The people of the town would bring him gifts, books, tools, fine cloth. They sought his advice on everything from planting seasons to the mending of a stone wall. He taught their children. He took them into the regenerating forest and showed them the signs he had learned. He taught them to read the language of the squirrels and the woodpeckers, to understand the meaning of a copper haze on the horizon. He lived for a very long time. He grew old, his back stooped, but his eyes as clear as ever. One autumn morning, decades after the Great Fire, he died peacefully in his sleep. The people of the new prosperity buried him not in a cemetery, but on the green roof of his own home, as he had requested. The dugout became a monument. They did not erect a grand statue. They simply placed a small, perfectly carved stone plaque beside the heavy iron door. It bore no name, only a simple inscription, a lesson for all the generations to come. It read, "He listened when we would not."